And at the time it sounded perfectly normal, but now it sounds completely archaic. My father would say things like, "Oh, this jacket looks fantastic, that'll last 20 or 30 years." Who buys clothes like that now? When you walk into this, the department store and you grab your latest Hugo Boss pair of jeans, you think if it lasts till the end of the week, you've done pretty well, but you don't think it's going to last 20 years, and it's not part of how you're approaching that subject. So our sense of temporality around concepts has completely changed. Okay? And if you look at the manufacture of objects, it's fairly clear that there is no sense that they're designed or built to last at all. Okay? They've got down to the lowest possible common denominator in terms of this will last maybe 5 seconds, good enough, out it goes. So we think we're reading media text and we congratulate ourselves on our ability to decode the more sophisticated pieces we encounter. And those of us in cultural studies spent a decade or more trying to teach kids how to really read advertisements, not fully understanding at the time we were just simply making them better consumers. That our kids who graduated from our schools were the most adept at getting advertisements, and what a great gift to commodity capitalism that was. But in fact, the sole purpose of advertisements, as Reisman was arguing, is to tutor us in the art of consumption. Therefore, everything we see on screen in magazines and newspapers and so on, regardless of its genre, is an advertisement. Now, as Deleuze and Guattari have argued, capitalism produces the subjects it requires. And I think that's, in many ways, their most provocative thesis, that capitalism produces the subjects it requires. And in fact, we can go a step further and say that our very idea of subjectivity is something this particular mode of production wants us to have. So we are, in fact, avatars of the system we think we created, but in fact, it created us. Now, my point is that not to say that digital technology is the problem. And though I've been talking about digital technology, what I really have been trying to talk about is capitalism. There have been and there will be endless complaints about the deleterious effects of digital technology in all its manifestations, from the smartphone to the auto manufacturing and so on and so forth. But this mistakes the means for the cause. I don't disagree with those theorists like Marshall McLuhan who argue that new technology has particular kinds of social and cultural effects. Obviously that is true. These can be identified and mapped. But I do disagree that these effects can be considered in isolation from larger social processes, particularly what Marxists refer to as the mode of production. The true cause of the various travails that these commentaries remark upon is capitalism itself. But what Deleuze and Guattari want to suggest is that we cannot separate the economic from the cultural, base from superstructure. Okay? That the two things go hand in hand. That capitalism is already cultural. That's how it manifests itself. And thus, capitalism perpetuates itself through the kinds of culture that it produces. So digital technology is merely capitalism's latest and most efficient means of achieving its goals, namely the perpetuation of a mode of production and a corresponding distribution of wealth. The smartphone wants to capture our attention because phone manufacturers want us to buy their product and upgrade it regularly. Telecommunication carriers want us to sign up for network carriage and upgrade our packages regularly. Online businesses want us to visit their sites and purchase products from them. Offline businesses want us to be prompted by their advertisements to purchase their products. Social media and news aggregator sites want us to visit their pages so they can sell our data to manufacturers, and so on and so on and so on. In other words, the final form of the commodity is the image, as Debord predicted, precisely because in the image the commodity ceases to be visible as a commodity. At the moment of its greatest visibility, it disappears. Now, schizophrenic is a bold choice of word for this state of affairs, and I don't mean to use it lightly. But I think it's not without foundation. Behaviour that passes for normal today is in many cases indistinguishable from the key clinical symptoms of schizophrenia. I don't know, again, this is sort of a social history moment, but do you remember the first time you saw somebody talking to themselves in a public place and thinking, oh my God, what's that weirdo doing? And then you realise they're talking on a cell phone. Remember when I first saw people who had this sort of, earbud and their thing and walking around airports gesticulating like this, I think, what on earth is that crazy person doing? And then realising they're on a cell phone. So now, when you walk into an airport, everybody looks like a lunatic. They walk around, talking to somebody but not to anyone in the room. In the old days, we would lock them up. They'd be, quick, get them into the basement. The person's clearly lost their grip on reality. This passes for normal now. We don't even think about it anymore. So when I say schizophrenic, I mean the things that we used to say looked mad now pass for normal. But I want to go further than that, because what's also true of contemporary society is that we listen to disembodied voices all day long. This is what advertisements are. Advertisements are disembodied voices. That's what schizophrenics suffer from. They hear voices telling them to do things. But that's our everyday life. Buy this, buy that. Constantly. There's people telling us to do things all the time. You need a new car, you should shave. Girls will like you if you wear that deodorant. And I've been seeing this advertisement since I've been here. There's apparently some fabulous deodorant available in India. I'm going to have to buy like a box of it. But when you spray on it, you just immediately get a six-pack, your hair grows long, and you look awesome. I don't know where I can get this stuff, but I'm definitely going to bring home at least a case of it when I go home. Because it must be true, right? So constantly being barraged by voices telling us to do things. And ultimately we start to believe these voices. Now that is schizophrenia. We act on disembodied voices. But not only that, we encourage them. We bring them into our lives. We have our iPhone and iPods. We watch screens all the time. We have created an environment of hyper-stimulus, the kind of environment that schizophrenics complain of as being their worst kinds of symptoms. So when I say schizophrenia society or schizo society, I mean it quite literally in that sense. And the provocative question is whether or not contemporary society should be thought of as being a kind of an illness. Now, I'm very far from being the first to suggest that what we're experiencing today can and should be thought of in terms of schizophrenia. Baudrillard, Deleuze, Jameson have made similar suggestions. Although their different accounts differ in the details, but the one thing that they all agree on, and this is the point that I really want to push, is that it is capitalism that is schizophrenizing. It is capitalism, it is the mode of production itself that is pushing us in this direction. The kids of today want to think of their connectedness as empowering. They want to believe they really do have the world in their pocket. They don't want to hear that the magical device that they have is enslaving. Not even the overworked executives who know for a certain fact that their life is dominated by their mobile phones want to hear this. This is because they're dominated by their jobs. But also in a much more problematic way, because capitalism has convinced us we have agency despite all the evidence to the contrary. So cultural critics who sing this song, who say devices are empowering, that popular culture and all its new toys are liberating, are really and ultimately singing to capitalism's hymn sheet. We're doing capitalism's work for us. There's nothing critical in what we're doing. Sadly, we don't even seem to realise this. So when these critics scold the iconoclasts like Adorno and Horkheimer for being gloomy about contemporary existence, they are simply doing capitalism's good work for them. Now I want to suggest that these symptoms that I'm calling schizo symptoms, and I've told you what they are a kind of barometer. They're a way of taking the temperature, of taking the pressure, of understanding the climate change in a cultural sense. And as I said, the question that we are faced with is whether or not we want to see these symptoms as being illnesses, signs of a disease, signs that something is wrong. Now, I'm not trying to suggest that they necessarily should be seen that way, but rather I do think what we're faced with is a sense by which not only is the world changing in ways that we haven't properly thought about, but changing in ways that we may actually want to be concerned about. And on that point, I will leave it. Thank you.
It's been very interesting. So many of you will have lots of questions to ask. So please, those of you who want to ask questions, please raise your hand. I will identify you, and then you can ask your question or comment. Would you like to?
Oh, no, it's okay.
Can you like take a bunch of
The way you put it, it seems like we have been all been caught under in this, onslaught of technology, where we don't have any choice to negotiate with technology, where we don't get to decide anything. For example, if it could be I get to decide whether I want to keep Facebook on my phone, whether I want music on my phone, whether I want to play games on my phones. So I would like your response on that. You have already talked about how agencies form, etc. But anyway, I would like you to develop a little bit on that. And secondly, what I was thinking was we have always changed and always negotiated in response to technology, right from whether it was the invention of the wheel, or whether it was the bomb, or whether it was the printing press, and now a digital technology. We have always negotiated with technology, and it has always changed us. So what is so radically new about the scenario right now? Yeah.
Is very closely associated to location. That is, you need to be physically present in a particular location to authentically have a sense of that particular situation. Now, you mentioned in your talk that you have friends from all over the place in the world, and you could be actually experiencing people's lives who are at a distance from you. So my question is that how is social research or social theory going to be redefined with this new meaning of experience itself?
Question first and then the second one. How is the technology radically new? Well, I mean, if you look at the kind of history of technology and you look, for example, at the speed of the uptake of technology, the cell phone's uptake has been astonishingly rapid, extremely rapid, and the kinds of transformations that it has brought about have also been extremely rapid. So it's taken place within less than 2 decades. We've gone to cell phones being something that a few people have to something that everybody has. Okay? And so that's the first thing. I think there's several layers to your question. Do we have choice? Yes, as an individual you have choice, but even that is not necessarily the case. So, for example, if you are a new academic joining my university, you do not have a choice about using email. You can't say to your boss, your head of school, no, I won't be reading email. And they say, well, no, you won't be employed. And it's that straightforward, right? You just simply can't do it. We have to use email. We're now told we have to use all the various online sites like Moodle and blah blah blah. All of which I think are the thin end of the wedge and the end of the world and so on. So I don't actually have a choice about that. And there is a large amount of the transformations of workplaces that are not about your choice. Yes, you may choose to have your Facebook on your phone, you may choose to own a phone, that's true. But insofar as the workplace is concerned, you don't have those kinds of choices. But even within a social sense, you don't necessarily have those choices either, because you would be ostracised from your friends. I know that, talking to my daughter, she looks down upon her friends that don't actually have a cell phone, so there is something kind of wrong with them. They should just get their life sorted and get a cell phone. So there is also a kind of social pressure to be engaged in this form of communication as well. But let's think about choice at a higher level. One of the difficulties of contemporary life is that even if we want to do something, we don't know how to do something. So, for example, I'm very concerned about climate change. I'm very concerned about the depletion of the biomass of the oceans and so on and so forth. But I don't actually know what I can do about it. I can choose to be good at recycling, I can choose not to eat fish, and so on and so forth. But these are not things that can be enacted by individuals. They can only be enacted collectively. So one of the fantasies of capitalism is that we actually have individual choice. So your narration was, I can choose to have a cell phone, I can choose this, I can choose that. But in some respects, those choices are completely inconsequential to the planet. It's the larger collective choices that actually we need to be concerned about. And that's much more difficult for us to conceptualise and much more difficult for us to deal with. So what's radically new about the cell phone? Well, for one thing, it has enacted a very powerful form of convergence. The cell phone is collecting all the other technologies and bringing them all into one place. Okay? So it's rendering redundant, all the other forms of technology. You don't need a stereo anymore, you don't need a TV anymore, you don't need a DVD, you don't need a computer, a laptop, whatever. All those functions are being brought into your phone. And it's also going to replace the credit card. I mean, it virtually has. In lots of places now, you can just simply use your phone and wave that at the machine and it'll pay the thing for you. So it's an incredible form of standardisation. It's standardising our experience, standardising our ways of interacting with other people, with other machines, with other things. That is phenomenal. I would say that the cell phone should be thought of in the same way that we think of money. It's a very powerful form of standardisation. Okay? And what it is bringing about, and what we are collectively as a planet enabling, is this standardisation. So now when you travel with your cell phone, you're like absolutely annoyed and surprised if you can't use it in whatever country you happen to be in. But nobody ever had that expectation in the past. You never expected to be able to just go to any old country in the world and just carry on doing all the same things you were doing in the previous country. In fact, half the point of travelling was to go somewhere where you couldn't do all those things. So even our notion of what counts as difference has been transformed. We don't expect to encounter difference anymore. We expect to encounter sameness. So what's interesting about the cell phone is that its effects as a form of technology are being experienced in a social, cultural way that we don't actually recognise as being part of its effects. Kinds of things I was talking about yesterday around the idea of assemblage theory is to try to come up with a conceptual means of mapping how this new device is bringing about these kinds of changes, which is a kind of segue to answer your question as to how social theory is going to have to change or to have to think about these things. Clearly, it's going to have to become more complex and better able to deal with complexity. It has to treat complexity not as a problem that needs to be reduced down to simplicity, but complexity as a form in and of itself, which is what a lot of people are trying to do now by bringing into play ideas of complexity theory and so on. It also has to rethink what is meant by presence, it has to rethink what is meant by location, it has to rethink what is meant by experience. There's some very interesting research that's coming, social research that's coming out of Japan at the moment, and it's sort of being announced as a national crisis. They're saying that young people have lost interest in having sex with each other, which is an astonishing social claim to make, and I don't pretend to know whether it's true or not true, but let's for the moment say that it is true. One of the arguments for this is that people find social interactions too complicated and too difficult compared to the interactions they can have with their cell phone. And so they can stay at home and play online games and whatever, and that just all feels so much easier and nicer. So the fact that we have a device in our pocket that can replace intimacy and experience with another person is astonishing. We should be astonished by that. Okay? We shouldn't treat that as normal, we should treat that as gobsmacking and amazing. How is it that people would actually prefer the company of their phone over other people? What does that say about transformations of sociality? So I think social theory into the future is going to have to come to grips with and think more seriously about interactions with the non-human and non-human types of interaction. And it's already doing that, so it's not like it's not aware of this as a problem. There are a large number of theorists that are already trying to come to grips with this, but that is the future of social theory.
I also do agree that it's quite seductive, so it's very convincing what you've said to us. But I want to, I was reminded in the way that you set it up in the first 4 things that you said of Marx's concept of alienation. And I want to ask you, is this all alienation with a digital twist, or is there something more to it? The second thing that I want to ask has to do with this idea of madness or schizophrenia. Can madness be seen as a voice that resists? So when you think of self-destruction, you present self-destruction as something that appears now to be normal and rational and not challengeable. But the destruction, but the care of the body is also something that we are being told to do. So when you're actually destructing and not caring for the body, that's also a form of, that could be seen as a form of resistance. So I think that there comes across then a kind of homogeneous picture of how we engage, which is what Srija's problem was, how we engage with this digital device. But actually there are multiple stories. And that brings me to my last point, which is of the point about decentering the I. And I got very excited when you said decentering the I, because for me, I think decentering the I is a way of getting to multiple voices. And you seem to say that decentering the I is about losing the ability to read multiple, to understand multiple voices.
Lecture with so much humor and mixing a lot of everyday reality with it, because that's when it makes deep sense. And continuing with some of the questions that Mahua has raised, I was thinking in the Indian context, we've had the experience of some recent social movements, what new social movements, if we can refer to them as such, in terms of campaigns, etc., around issues of violence against women, rape, corruption, etc., where the social media has been used in this manner of, being able to very quickly get people to come together. And I was thinking about this aspect of connectedness and how you defined connectedness, and a particular cultural context that we live in India, where just very recently it was extremely difficult to actually make for such mobilization. So how do we look at this in terms of, on the one hand, certain global, universally applicable changes that you have talked about, but also these multiple stories in terms of how this can play different roles and how people actually use their agency in this way.
And for a wonderful talk, and of course Professor Mandal for making us stay away from our screens for at least 2 hours. Now, what kind of questions that I have, please do not confuse them for any kind of post-colonial rhetoric. My main maybe issue with you would be your idea of intimacy. I think you are very drawn by the idea of intimacy, which is based on freedom. In India, intimacy is forced. Intimacy is controlled. Therefore, I think someone like Adam Smith, who has a very different reading of capitalism, who suggests that capitalism only humans can create, and freedom is central to the idea of capitalism. Right? And I think this has to be read in conjunction with this theory of moral sentiments. So something that humans can, of course, run after commodity, run after money, but they may also possibly have morals. Right? Now, I'll therefore, for me, the way anti-Oedipus worked for me was, I thought Schizo was also revolutionary, because he tries to break out of the normality. Consuming, running after things that are given by the commodification is a problem, so he tries to break out of it. How would you therefore look at the later work that comes of Deleuze and Guattari, 1,000 Plateaus? Right? How is this linked to that? And what I would also, for instance, you said we are so controlled by phones. I would like to draw some antagonisms. I try to use phone for directions while driving car. It always gives me wrong directions in India. Right? So I have to get down and ask people, they give me the best directions. Right? Recently there was some Jat community in North India. It's also essential that we understand caste in India, we cannot let it go. Phones are banned for young girls. You cannot use them in villages. Right? And therefore somewhere, the sameness that you're working out is very complex in a world where freedom itself is negotiated variously. I can give you I work in Maharashtra. I don't want to introduce you to caste, you will get lost. But there are 2 castes. One is called Maratha, which is a dominant caste, and second one which is slightly lower than it, called the Banjari. The Marathas consider them lower. During the elections in 2009, when I was chasing a party, the Marathas were circulating messages saying that Hatwa Tutari, Vazwa Tutari, Hatwa Vanjari. What that means is, Tutari is a Maratha trumpet. So you blow your trumpet and get the Vanjaris out of here. Now, how technology can be used is still a matter of human agency. And maybe too much freedom has affected in the West. We are very, innovative in taking care of our freedom in a dispersed manner. Though decentered, we have managed to do that. Maybe you would just like to comment on some of these aspects. I'm sorry I spoke for long.
So incredibly difficult questions to try to get my head around. I think I'll go in reverse order this time. So I guess the first point is the people who make cell phones don't actually care what you do with cell phones. Okay. So there's no consequence to them what you do with it, so long as you buy it and you pay for the subscription and you use your data. So at a sheerly commercial point of view, the point I'm trying to make is that cell phones are commodities. They are part of a commodity universe. We need to make that break in our thinking to try to understand how they're actually working. Yes, they are useful devices. Yes, they get taken up in ways that are highly productive. All forms of social movements have used them because they were highly useful. But that doesn't mean that they're not commodities. It doesn't mean that they're not being sold to profit corporations. So we have to make a radical shift in how we think about them in order to really grasp what they are. Cell phones are commodities first of all. Okay? In terms of the idea of, I guess I'm kind of answering all three questions at the same time because they have some similar themes. I mean, the idea of capturing multiple stories has been part of anthropology, ethnography, cultural studies, and so on and so forth. In a way, one could argue that this idea of wanting to capture multiple stories is consistent with a capitalist ideology that is relentlessly individualizing. Every story is important. Every story, every individual matters. Now, I'm not trying to say that every individual doesn't matter, but the net effect of that is to downgrade the idea of the social and the idea of the society such that you get to the point where someone like Margaret Thatcher can say, there is no society. Okay? So we have to be kind of careful that we have this sort of double-edged sword. When we try to capture multiple stories, when we valorize the idea of multiple individual stories, we are also separating ourselves from an idea of the collective, of the common, of things that are larger than ourselves, and forgetting the fact, as I was saying earlier, that there are a large number of things that can only be done collectively, that only exist because of the collective. And I think it takes a kind of radical gesture now to remind people of that.
I saw somebody raising their hand back there.
It's a really interesting question, and it's not something that I had really thought about in quite the way that you framed it, so I am grateful for the question. I do agree. I think that some aspects of a sort of self-destruction and of a self-destructive lifestyle are a kind of resistance. And certainly the people who work in public health find that people that they're trying to encourage to quit smoking or to eat a better diet or to take some exercise or whatever, find that those kinds of instructions to them are a kind of imposition on their lifestyle. Therefore, as an act of resistance, they continue to smoke or to eat too much or whatever. But for me then, I understand that, but then that creates a very interesting problem or a very interesting kind of way for us to think about our society. If killing yourself is the only way to resist the forces that you feel are kind of closing in on you, then that is a really desperately sad situation. So, yes, I think one could see madness or these kinds of self-destructions as an act of resistance, and I don't disagree with that. But I guess I would also want to say, well, then we should see them as symptoms of the fact that the social is not reaching out to people in a way that enables them to care for themselves in a sustainable way. So my idea of care would always go back to Spinoza, whose model of health was that health should be that which constantly enriches and enables your capacity to persist in your being. And I think that we kind of have created a society when that model of health is not uniformly embraced. And for me, that would be a radical intervention to try to make. With respect to being, I absolutely love your phrase, and I'm going to steal it and use it forevermore without attribution, so you heard it here. Alienation with a digital twist, I think it's fabulous. If you want to get it out there and publish it beforehand, send me the link. But it's an absolutely brilliant phrase. So am I talking about alienation? I don't think I am. There's lots of different definitions of alienation and lots of different ways that we can talk about it. But I suppose the fundamental definition of alienation would be a separation of the self from itself and the becoming other of itself. I'm not necessarily saying that. When I say, and I'm talking about the decentering of the I, I'm talking about its inability to totalise its world. In other words, we exist in a multi-presencing world that we cannot totalise. It is more vast and getting vaster all the time, such that we cannot master the world that we are creating. So we are becoming kind of pawns within that. But I'm also saying that the very thing that we think of as being ourselves is a product of that kind of communication device of the world, media and so on. So I'm not saying that the self as a true thing is being separated and forced into a kind of other position. I think that's a fairly old-fashioned way of trying to understand what's happening. Rather, I'm saying that very sense of ourselves as other is a symptom of our society. Or rather, not a symptom, that's the wrong way of putting it, is an artefact of our society. It's what our society wants from us. But thank you for the questions, it's really great. And also the other questions as well, I didn't mean to suggest they weren't also too. Sorry, go ahead.
I'm a former student of KSS and currently I'm a policy advocacy specialist in Bangalore. My question is very simple, but I need to have a perspective of yours on this. You're talking about human interactions changing when capitalism tries to push certain, like you say, mobile phone into our lives, the way they push it, the way they create the collective desire to have a mobile phone. Capitalism is also shaping, let's say, technology in a way that helps. Let's say healthcare in the rural sector, healthcare for the marginalized. What is your prognosis of the fact that the interaction aspect, let's say between the health provider and those who are supposed to be provided with certain healthcare, would be shaped in the future because of this technological advancement, where technology is taking the forefront in healthcare rather than the people who are interacting with those who require healthcare services. So do you think that this interaction issue would come over there? Do you think that the interaction problem would come in, or this interaction with the technology interface would improve the situation for healthcare in a country like India?
The kind of project that I've been initiating here is that I think it's important for us to have the courage to critique even the things that we like and even the things that we think are good. So I'm not trying to say that technology is intrinsically bad, because that's clearly a nonsense. There are many, many things that technology does that make our lives infinitely better than they would be otherwise. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be critical of it, that we shouldn't approach it with a critical eye. So I sort of want to separate that out and say, yes, there are good things about technology, but let's be kind of think about it. The larger kinds of questions you're asking around healthcare and technology are quite interesting, but you know, one of the things that we tend to forget, and it's kind of a sort of ideological reason, is that the very invention of the internet was a product of a socialist mode of thinking, which is the American army. Okay? The US military is a massively socialist enterprise. You know, Eisenhower famously said that, right? He said, if you want socialism, join the army. And so what the military did was fund the creation of all the technology that led to what we call the internet. Capitalism has subsequently commodified and you know, packaged and turned into something it can sell, something that was originally a socialist or a commons kind of thing. And that is the kind of thing that Marx always talks about. You have the enclosure of the commons, and then capitalism takes over. So I guess the point that I'm trying to make then is with respect to health, insofar as we see health as a commons, as something that everyone should be concerned about, that is and should be the concern of government, then I would imagine it can bring good to everybody. But the minute we think of the health as commons that should then be commodified, then you have a problem. So the issue is not around technology, it's around whether or not health is seen as a social good or a commodity. And clearly the difference between the American model of health and the model of health, say, that exists in Britain, is that for the Americans your health is a commodity. Okay? Whereas in Britain with the National Health Scheme, which is being killed, I have to admit, it's a very tragic tale, but in its original conception, it conceived of the health of the population as being a social good that shouldn't be seen as a commodity.
One of the interesting things that you talked about was about the notion of enslavement or the endangeredness of being that one encounters in amidst this kind of existence directed by technoscience. Okay, how would this contemporary endangeredness or enslavementness, for example, would coexist with traditional enslavements, whether it reproduces them, whether it permeates them, whether it complicates them, it must be doing something. Meaning we have all different kinds of enslavements which seem to coexist, specifically with this kind of contemporary globalization. It seemed to coexist with the new. Okay. So yes, for example, for the earlier, kind of industrial age of nuts and bolts, indeed there was this view of we being cog in the machine, yes. But that kind of existence required some kind of a restructuring of space wherever that that age went. Whereas in contemporary form of enslavement, it seem to tell us that you just have to reorient yourself to this form of enslavement or being without actually restructuring it. It does not really restructure your location, as he was saying. That doesn't really lead to need to restructure location. Maybe location can merely reorient itself to the demands of new enslavement. So, I find this very interesting kind of complication which emerged with this view. Now, this is a very interesting way into which you put forth the idea of Schizo society as being normal. There is normalization and naturalization again of Schizo society. That then also would lead to very different kind of ontological implications. What is the nature of work? What is the nature of reality? Is there any nature to reality? Is there any reality at all? So, very, very complicated kind of question of what really emerge. And the last thing, I thought was, of course, there are many things, but one of the things perhaps could be, why is it that we assume people wish to be connected? It appears that they are connected. It appears that they are connecting to each other. But many times they are not connecting. They are not communicating also. Sometimes, for example, I wish to be connected, but I do not have anyone connecting with me. You see, both. In fact, in terms of contemporary idea where I want to see whether somebody has written email to me or not. And if there is no email, I am uneasy. So people don't want to be connected. Or the other way, for example, I'm butchered, I'm tortured, I'm killed. That is experience here. Okay, about caste violence. I'm making friendly calls to people. Come on, please, look and help me. And nobody is listening to my calls. You see. So this whole idea that people are communicating and that the communication is being reached, okay, itself is a kind of assumption that we are doing.
Yeah. Oh, look, connected as people wanting to be connected is actually, it's manifestly true. And one of the ways you can see this is that if you look at the ways in which telephone plans are being marketed now in Australia, particularly to teenagers, one of the things that is packaged as making the cell phone plan attractive is, so for example, my daughter's package has infinite text messaging, but a very limited phone call plan. So in other words, what teenagers are doing is that they are texting each other, but they're not calling each other. And I remember when email sort of became available in the office at work, I remember having the extraordinary experience of thinking, I can't really be bothered to go and talk to my colleagues, so I'm just going to send them an email, even though they're in the office next door. Extraordinary transformation of the idea of communication. And I think you're right, we delude ourselves if we call that being connected, or it's a kind of transformation of what being connected actually means. So there is a whole range of questions to be asked around that as a kind of transformation of intimacy. With respect to enslavement, I think the thing that's fascinating for me is that it's a willing enslavement, and an enslavement we don't recognise as an enslavement. We do this work for Facebook, we help make Facebook a big corporation, and we do it willingly, and we pay for the privilege of doing it. That's a very different form of enslavement. Older models of enslavement, people didn't pay to be a slave. They might pay to get out of it, but they didn't pay to become part of it. The other thing, that there has been some very interesting work done on the kind of construction of cell phones. So cell phones are largely manufactured in China, particularly iPhones manufactured by Foxconn in China, under horrendous conditions, such that that particular factory had a very, very high, such a high rate of suicide amongst its workers. They had to put nets around the edge of the building so that you couldn't kill yourself, that if you jumped off the roof you would land on a trampoline. So it's such a terrible workplace. One of the other things that a colleague of mine has done is to kind of map the geology of the mobile phone. And what he found is that there are elements within the phone from up to 70 different countries, some of which, some of the elements are actually what are known as conflict minerals, like conflict diamonds or blood diamonds, because they come from areas where they are, the resources are owned by warlords and so forth. So the cell phone is a highly unethical device, and of course the place where all cell phones go to die is India. So the cell phones are manufactured in China from materials from Africa, and they come to India to die, where they're broken up in a really kind of unsafe, unsustainable, unprotected way that is leading to deaths amongst the workers who actually do this. So at a very material level, the cell phone is an enormously toxic device as well, and that's something that we don't want to think about. So there's lots of different ways by which we need to engage with our new devices in a material way, in a kind of cultural, social way, and just in a flat-out economic, political way. Yeah, thank you.
And last question.
Yes, if I may just take a minute to ask about, is it possible, we can look at it more positively, that this is only a period of trial and error, and we would get over this maybe in another, if you look at the longer time scale of say 30 or 40 or 50 years, rather than look at it for 10 years and come to conclusions. It's not likely that we will get more positives if we look at it that way, rather than rely on the mistakes that we apparently make during this short period.
Yesterday is, if you go back in history to the time of the invention of the steam engine in the 1750s, and you think about the radical transformations that the use of steam engines was able to bring about, one could argue that the invention of the steam engine and the use of coal as a form of energy was a powerful social, cultural, transforming force. But let's look at some of the things that happened as a consequence of it. Just to put it in an Indian context, once Britain had the steam engine and it could manufacture cotton, the first thing that it did was to dismantle cotton manufacturing in India. Okay, it destroyed the factories and said, well, we'll export your cotton to Britain where you'll get woven into materials and then we'll send it back and try and sell it to you. So I don't think we can rely on capitalism to be inherently good, even if the potential for social ameliorative and transformative forces are there. We can't rely on capitalism to do it. If we project forward from that moment in the 1750s to now, we realise that it was an astonishing mistake, because all that coal that has been burned is steadily poisoning the planet, and if we don't figure out how to stop using it, the global situation is going to become extremely dire. So my point is simply, we don't know. We don't know what is going to come as a result of the new technology that we're dealing with now. We don't know whether it's going to be good or bad. The point I'm simply trying to make is that we should at least be asking the question as to whether it is good or bad, rather than kind of going along with the marketing people who tell us that it is implicitly good. I don't believe that for a second, but I'm willing to acknowledge that there are some good things about it, but there are many things about it that I also find concerning. And it would seem to me that critical theory and a critical response would be to engage with it in as kind of open a way as we can to see what are the positives, what are the negatives, and where should the future go. Thank you.
Penetrate into society, but there are also very specific questions related to cell phones, because that I think was the prime example that it was using. But anyone could make similar arguments about a whole range of technologies, as he explained in response to the last question. And of course, there were a lot of specific questions arising from our own unique social contexts as well, which makes us question not just the positives or the negatives of the technology, but also about capitalism as this battering ram kind of force and what it can do and what it cannot do. We know that there are social structures here which are resistant to the kind of effects that capitalism and technology can bring in. So I think those kinds of discussions will always be there with us. Thank you very much for coming and for listening to the talk and for raising all those questions. I don't know if these are the usual kind of questions that you get, or
oh no, they're sensational questions.
Yeah. So thank you very much, and thanks for a very interesting talk. I'll now hand you over to Professor Mandal for an announcement.
Yeah, I'm very sorry. There's a nice cup of tea. I don't know if it's become cold by now, but please do join us, and you can further interact with speakers here. I just wanted to say a word of thanks to all of you, as well as thank the institution, our Dean, School of Development Studies, as well as the Director, Tata Institute of Social Sciences, for giving us this opportunity to host Professor Buchanan and have this meeting. Thank you all for coming, and I hope you enjoyed this evening, and we'll take it forward, make it more dramatic, problematic, difficult and disturbing in the coming days. Thanks very much. Please have a cup of tea downstairs.